This is not to say that every time an American Indian got the sniffles after 1620, there was some evil white man lurking in the bushes that gave him the dread disease. What it is to say, on the other hand, is that you can't simply take the assumption that Axtell was peddling, which is standard, it's orthodoxy, that any Indian who dies of disease, there's nobody culpable for. We got at least one case that's proven by documents. We got others, several of them that are pretty clear-cut, commonsensical, logical continuum kind of, yeah, the probability is great, this needs to be looked at more. In any event, there's no absolution involved in saying Indians died of disease rather than other things, but that whole argument, that 3/4 of however many there were died of disease and therefore there's no one culpable, is intended to take your attention away from the fact that you still got a quarter of 15 million people who didn't die of disease. They didn't disappear from that. What did they disappear from? Wholesale massacres and a whole stream. Then you could begin with, well, you could probably begin it in Plymouth Colony, but let's begin it with somebody besides the English and call it the Dutch. You know that little childhood fable you were told about the Indians sold Manhattan Island to the Dutch for $15 worth of trinkets and beads? Ain't so. They didn't sell a damn thing. They didn't understand themselves to own property in the sense that you could alienate it that way. What they did was, in exchange and a gesture of respect to the Dutch, allowed the Dutch free usage of the tip of the island for purposes of trade, which was to everybody's advantage. They were basically renting it from the Indians. But that was not satisfactory. So that was resolved by them sending a little military expedition up the island and encountering a group which certainly didn't call itself this, but is known in history as the Wappinger Indians, part of the Raritan Confederation. And they did what they did so fast they didn't believe they'd be believed when they went back and reported what they'd done, problem solved. So they took the heads of the Indians, or at least the important ones, with them in wicker baskets and put them on display in what was then called New Amsterdam. And by golly, had a jolly little public celebration of the fact that their enemies were vanquished, and here's the proof. They used the heads for a game of kickball at roughly the position where the World Trade Center used to stand. So there's the origins of the economy that was manifest symbolically in the Twin Towers that were knocked down in 9/11/2001. You know, it sort of sits at the foot of Wall Street. Wall Street, which gets its name from the wall of the enclosure where they maintained the market for slaves. So that was not simply a Southern tradition. Wall Street was the slave market in New York. And not metaphorically, we're talking literally. The economy was built on the blood and bones of Indians with the flesh of chattel slaves. And then they had the audacity to make reference to the beneficiaries and perpetuators of that tradition as being somehow or another inherently innocent. Well, Americans are by definition innocent in their own minds because they had every right to do whatever it is they do to anyone and everyone they encounter in the process of working their will upon the world as a chosen people, enjoying their manifest destiny to rule supreme. But let's go now, briefly, to that other quarter. And we can talk about it. Anybody got a $20 bill? Well, look, whose picture's on it. It's called a guy by the name of Andrew Jackson. That's what he was called. Andrew Jackson was the President of the United States. He rode into the presidency, they say, because of his victory over the British during the War of 1812 in New Orleans. So the War of 1812 was over by the time they fought the battle, but he didn't get word. Mistakes do happen. But you usually don't get propelled into the White House on the basis of a mistake. What actually propelled, he's a backwoods guy. He was the officer in charge of the prosecution of the campaign to put down the Red Stick Rebellion, the Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge were trapped by Jackson's men after a few grotesqueries along the way that you can read in the journals of Davy Crockett and another. This is the reality of the process of clearing the land. What he ultimately culminated in the Creek campaign was that they trapped the Red Sticks almost en masse at the Great Bend, the Horseshoe Bend as it's called, the Tallapoosa River, brought up cannons, overcame their defense work and killed them all. People jumping off the banks into the river trying to get away, and you had guys that were standing there from about the range we're talking about, putting whole loads of heavy buckshot, military buckshot engines, and they weren't even using rifles for this purpose. And again, they killed so many they didn't believe they would be believed. I mean, Jackson had this great victory over the Indians on his hands, but he knew that no one was going to believe they really killed as many Indians as they killed that day. They killed somewhere in the vicinity of 800. That's a lot of people in frontier warfare. Said his troops cut the noses. Now they're not taking heads anymore, they're just cutting the noses off for purposes of confirming body count. Okay? That's in, what, 1815. By the time you get to 1965, we're taking ears instead. I was in country with people who were wearing them as necklaces, sending them home to their girlfriends and so forth. You can go into World War II and talk in a Life magazine, see a woman whose son who was from Camp Pendleton, by the way, sent the scalp of a slain Japanese as a trophy to his mother. She nailed it on the door so the whole neighborhood could see. Another guy who sent a letter opener made out of a thigh bone. You could go to the Sullivan campaign in 1794, and the elite units in his group, again Rangers, were wearing human skin tan leggings when they came home to show how efficient they were in overcoming the Red Devils. You got this whole series of massacres that run from Horseshoe Bend through Sand Creek to Wounded Knee. You've got stops at the Washita River, and it's a long, long list. It begins at the foot of the World Trade Center, and it ends in a ravine in South Dakota. But in the interim, you got all these claims that this was just rough and tumble kind of warfare that was imposed by the conditions of the frontier and by the techniques of fighting that were deployed by the Indians themselves. If you can blame the victim, okay, that always works out kind of handy. And this still wasn't genocide, not only because the Indians resisted. I guess you've got to be passively slaughtered in order to be eligible for any kind of status in this regard. But also because there was no central authority who issued a decree to exterminate the Indians. Never mind that I live in a state where I can show you the front page of the Rocky Mountain News from 1864 would type this big, literally saying, exterminate them. Territory by territory, expansionist area by expansionist area. Extermination was literally the terminology that was used by those in charge. It's not something that I'm assigning retroactively in time. It's part of the documentary record. That part cannot be in question, but it's denied too. But for those who don't want to see essential authority issuing an order that could be even the most rigorous definition, the most restrictive definition of genocide applicable, consider this. Every single state of the Union or territory during the period that it was a territory of the U.S. once the U.S. was established, and in every antecedent colony, at least in the East and down to Mexico as well, you had in place scalp bounty. What is a scalp bounty? That's payment for proof of death of an American Indian. If you could prove death by producing the scalp with both ears so that you wouldn't cheat the taxpayers, you didn't want to split the scalp in two, okay, and collect twice. You had to have both ears attached to the scalp to collect the bounty. They would pay for a scalp or bloody red skin. That's where red skin comes from. It's really not about melanin. So that football team out there in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is really not just a racial slur. It's basically a celebration of Hannibal Lecter, if you want to think about it. Buffalo Bill, or whoever it was making the dresses out of skin of the victims. Yeah, well, that wasn't a movie that we're talking about now. That was the historical reality, and they had it on a graduated scale. Along about 1740 in Pennsylvania colony, they were paid 40 pounds sterling for proof of death of a fighting age male Indian. Didn't matter which Indian, from which group, Indian. 40 pounds sterling is roughly the equivalent of the annual wage of your average farmer. This is not insignificant money. They're paying big bucks for proof of death of Indians. Any Indians. They wanted the Indians gone. As a species, basically. For proof of death of a child being defined as a human being of either sex under 10 years of age down to and including fetus. That's as an exterminatory policy as is possible to conceive. And it was in effect in every single domain that is now the United States. No, there was not a central authority. Washington, D.C. did not put out the bounty, but it did compensate California, for example, for its expenditures on payment of bounties to the people who became professional scalp hunters as a result of this. I mean, it's better work than farming. It's better work than mining. You're not going to get mightily rich like the people with the home stake mine and so on, but you're going to have an income better than your peers.